So I responded to this post from Random House talking about a set of new book releases. And, it's not that this is a set of books that I'm choosing out. This is the publisher saying, hey, here's our new books, check them out. They're really exciting. And so you look through them, what are they putting out right now in the middle of 2020? It's, a bunch of stuff that are set, decades ago, or, all ancient fantasy is something akin to a 18th century travel narrative, sailing the seas, sea voyages, and there's one book among the 12 that is really about not just 2020, not just the 2010s, but the 21st century in general. You have a book about a very specific subject of prosecution and concerns about the legal system, and that that's interesting. And a lot of the other books individually sound good for various reasons. Some of the novels sounded interesting. There was one Minecraft one that I sort of hesitantly counted as being about digital technology in some capacity, where it has this Minecraft theme. Much of the content, from what I could tell, is still just this sort of travel narrative, voyaging around the seas, dealing with pirates, and so on. Something that could just be a 200-year-old adventure story, but it does, from what I can tell, have some elements of game logic and stuff, and this idea of inventory, and like you are a character in the game, places those sorts of restrictions onto what happens in the story, and so I'm sure it's not necessary for me, but that it's probably interesting for people who are grow up with the games, and they're playing it, and they want those sorts of fun adventure stories. But the thing is the collective of these books, where what I want isn't that Random House be pumping out cyberpunk novels, but that you have novels in this stack of new releases where characters have heard of telephones, that if two characters want to communicate with each other, that maybe one of them will call the phone that the other person definitely has on their person at that moment, or will perhaps even send an email, something that people have had for decades now, or they'll send a text message, or they'll vague blog about them on social media, knowing that the person will read it, or that someone in their social circle will see it and pass it on. And so, these are just sort of possibilities. And the thing is, it's possible for someone in the 21st century to not live in that world. Occasionally you'll have a account of someone who just chooses to live off the grid, and they make all these efforts, and they are efforts in many ways to not have a phone handy at any given moment, to not have an active email account other than maybe within limited business hours for business purposes, to not be hyper connected in this way. But that doesn't exist within this larger social scale within which most novels and narratives take place. That once you start to have half a dozen or so characters, they're not all living off the grid under normal circumstances. They have this whole new way of life that we are now experiencing. And so you have these new releases, and so some of them sound interesting in their own right, but they're historical novels, they're fantasy novels about, long ago, about these radically, different circumstances that without our technology, there, and all these other sort of other possibilities, things that avoid writing about the present. And so you have this sort of infinite, or whatever possibility of how you can create the setting of your novel. And so why make it this sort of high-tech present or near future, or smart city or whatever, but ultimately, even outside of my specific interest in seeing narratives and seeing how writers play around with these new dynamics and seeing how they choose to create narratives about these things, it just, there's a sort of laziness to it in the grand scheme, where on the one hand, writers, choosing to avoid this, choosing to write what they know from reading other novels, which, obviously, historically, novels have not been set in the 21st century high-tech world. In many cases, if they have, it's been, stuff like cyberpunk, and so these writers aren't trying to write cyberpunk. They want to write something like, these other 20th century novels that they really like, and so they end up writing what is ultimately historical fiction, and so they work on that, and I don't blame any writers on a individual scale, but it's the grand scheme of all of this, and it's the sort of publishing world where so in this case it's Random House, but I don't mean to pick on them individually either, but it's like, here's our 12 new releases for May 2020, and just sort of none of them are actually set in or about the 21st century.